They called it a dead hatchery. Then the dry trough started moving.
Nora Elise Vale opened the probate papers on the tailgate of her pickup with river mud dried on her boots and a cold wind moving through the Ranger Road turnout behind her. The truck was parked where the gravel widened just enough for two vehicles to pass if neither driver cared about paint. Below the road, Alder Run cut through dark pines in a narrow white line still full from April snowmelt. Nora had slept in the cab the night before because the campground gate was locked and because the trail crew bunkhouse no longer had a bed with her name on it. The first page of the probate packet named her Uncle Simon Vale deceased. The second named the property. A deserted trout hatchery on the north bank of Alder Run, including the egg trough room, spring intake, concrete raceways, brood, tank shed, footbridge feed room, and office. The third page named the problem. County cleanup notice pending. She read it with one hand pressed flat to keep the pages from lifting in the wind. Her checking account held $194. Her insurance bill was overdue by $620. Her truck registration had a month left if nobody looked closely. The trail crew had let her go 2 weeks earlier after she refused to sign off on unfinished erosion work near a washed-out culvert. The supervisor called it seasonal restructuring. The men who still had bunks called it bad timing and stopped meeting her eyes. By the time her cousin Grant called, she already knew the tone before she answered. "You got the papers?" he asked. "Yes." "Then you know it's a liability." Nora looked toward the creek where spring water shouldered past rocks with the kind of force that made conversation feel temporary. "I know Uncle Simon left it to me. He left you a cleanup bill. The lodge owner wants the spring intake access. You sign that piece over, he'll cover the county fees and you walk away clean." Clean was a word people liked using when they wanted someone else to carry the mud. "I haven't seen it yet," she said. Grant sighed. "Nora, it's a dead hatchery. Broken concrete, rusted screens, no stock, no permits. Simon kept every useless thing that ever crossed his hands." She folded the packet once and slipped it back into the envelope. "Then I'll look at it in daylight." Grant's silence sharpened. "Don't make this hard." She ended the call. A second number rang before she could put the phone down. This one belonged to May Rowan at County Records. Nora had spoken to her once after Simon's funeral when the woman pressed a folded receipt into her hand and told her that paperwork was only boring when it belonged to somebody else. "I heard Grant reached you," May said without greeting. "I did." "Then hear me next. Don't sign the spring intake access papers until you walk the site. Not the intake, not the footbridge, not one boundary agreement." Nora looked at the envelope in her lap. "Why?" "Because your uncle filed things when people assumed he only collected junk." "What things?" "See the hatchery first," May said, "in daylight. And if water moves where it shouldn't, write down where you were standing." The line went dead before Nora could ask more. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The Hatchery Road left the ranger route half a mile below the turnout and dropped toward the creek through wet cedar and lodgepole pine. Branches brushed both sides of the pickup. Snow lingered in the ditch where the sun had not reached dirty at the edges and punched through by deer tracks. The building appeared all at once after a bend low rectangular gray with weather, its corrugated roof sagging over the feed room corner, and its raceways stretching outside like empty concrete coffins. Nora parked beside a rusted gate and sat with both hands on the wheel. The hatchery was larger than she remembered. She had been there twice as a child, once in spring when Simon let her hold a thermometer over a trough, once in late summer when the raceways were full of shadow and fish moved like slips of smoke. Now moss choked the spring intake grate. The creek footbridge had dropped on one side. The office window was cracked diagonally and the feed room roof had folded inward where a snow load had found a weak seam. Still, the place did not look dead. It looked unattended. She took the olive canvas rucksack from behind the seat, pulled the faded red wool cap down over her short dark hair, and crossed the yard. Her blue rain jacket snapped once in the wind. The first raceway had a long crack near the bottom. The second was filled with cedar needles and silt. Rusted gate screens leaned against the brood tank shed, and the overflow ditch had packed itself with mud cone scales and green moss. At the footbridge she stopped. The creek moved fast beneath it. One timber rail leaned outward. A plank near the middle had split lengthwise and lifted at the edge. Nora picked up a fallen cedar limb and pressed it against the first plank before trusting her boot to it. The bridge held but not kindly. Inside the hatchery building, the air was colder than outside. It smelled of damp concrete, old feed dust, and creek stone. The south office sat to the left, narrow and dim, with a wooden desk. A wall of yellowed temperature charts and a metal file cabinet bent near the bottom drawer. Straight ahead was the egg trough room. Long wooden trays sat in 2 rows on cedar stands, dry and pale where water had not touched them for years. Broken egg screens lay stacked against the wall. A pipe chase ran along the north side toward the spring intake passage. Nora stood in the doorway and listened. No pup, no motor, no running water inside. She stepped to the first trough and touched the bottom. Dust came away on her fingers. Dry, she checked the intake valve on the wall. Closed. The metal wheel had rust around the stem and a paper tag wired to it, "Do not open without county review." She turned away. Behind her something trembled. At first it was only a line of movement across the trough. A shiver so slight she thought the wind had pushed the building. Then the surface changed, though there was no visible water pooled there. Fine dust and pine pollen gathered in a thin, bright seam down the trough's center. The seam quivered, widened, and traveled from the intake end toward the drain slot. Nora did not breathe. A ripple moved through the empty egg trough. Not a splash, not a leak from overhead. A pulse under the dry wooden tray, strong enough to lift the pollen in a soft wave and send it trembling end to end. She looked at the valve. Closed. She looked at the pipe. Dry outside. She looked at the cracked office window, the still charts, the dark passage to the intake. The trough rippled again. Nora reached for her notebook with hands that no longer felt cold. May had said to write down where she was standing. She wrote, "Egg trough room. Intake valve closed. No visible water." Ripple moved south. The pencil shook anyway. At the end of the trough, the pine pollen trembled one last time and settled in a narrow line bright against dry cedar. Nora left the hatchery without crossing the footbridge a second time until she had marked the bad planks with strips torn from an old flagging roll in the feed room. The flagging was brittle and faded orange, but it held around the rail well enough to warn anyone with eyes. She tied one strip near the split plank, one near the leaning rail, and one at the far end where the west support had dropped toward the creek. The work took only a few minutes. It changed almost nothing. Still, the bridge looked less like a trap once its worst places had names. When she reached the truck, a county SUV was parked behind it. Iris Bell stood beside the front bumper with a hard hat under one arm and a field case at her feet. She was 27, narrow-shouldered and rain-streaked, with a fisheries patch sewn crookedly to her jacket and a braid tucked into her collar. She looked at the hatchery before she looked at Nora. "You Vale, Nora, Iris Bell, May Rowan sent me." She nodded toward the building. She said the intake was talking. Nora hesitated. That how she put it? No. She said you might have water movement in a dead system, but her version had more paperwork in it. That was enough to make Nora trust her for the next 10 minutes. They walked back toward the hatchery together, Iris stopping every few steps to read the land. She checked the overflow ditch, the raceway cracks, the slope toward the creek, and the moss-choked grate at the spring intake north of the building. She did not enter the bridge until Nora pointed out the flagged planks. Then she tested the first one with the butt of a measuring rod. "Good," Iris said. "You marked instead of trusted. I used to work trail crew. Then you know old wood tells the truth late." Inside the egg trough room, the air had gone still. The pollen line remained in the first trough, bright and narrow, where the ripple had gathered it. Iris set her field case on the floor, took out a flashlight, a small mirror, and a notebook already softened at the corners by weather. "Show me what you touched." Nora did. The trough bottom, the intake valve, the pipe chased the north wall. Iris checked each in order, then lay on her side to look beneath the trough stand. She did not pretend mystery until she had run out of simple things. "The trough itself is dry," she said, "but the support rail under it is carrying vibration. From the creek, maybe. From the spring box, more likely." Iris stood and brushed dust from her sleeve. A closed valve stops open flow. It doesn't always stop pressure pulse if the old pipe is still wet behind it. Nora looked toward the north passage where the intake line disappeared into shadow. So, it's not impossible. Nothing useful ever is. Iris checked the valve tag and frowned at the paper wire. County review. Cleanup pending. That explains the tape. But this system wasn't fully decommissioned. How can you tell? Because somebody left it in a condition that could be measured, not abandoned. That sentence followed Nora into the office. The south office smelled of damp paper and mouse droppings. Temperature charts lined one wall in curling sheets, each printed with ruled columns for date, water, temperature, hatch stage, release notes, and remarks. Most were blank. Some had Simon's compact handwriting in the margins. A metal file cabinet sat under the window. Above the desk, mounted in a wooden frame, was an older chart printed on thicker paper and protected by cloudy glass. Nora wiped dust from the frame with her sleeve. The chart listed monthly creek temperatures from 1979 through 1986. In the lower corner, scratched into the wood beneath the frame, were two initials, SV. She touched them with one knuckle. "Your Uncle Iris asked." "Simon Vale." "Then don't pull the frame off the wall." Nora glanced at her. "I wasn't going to." "You look like a person about to." Nora let her hand fall. Outside, a truck came down the lodge road fast enough to send gravel ticking against the gate. Grant Vale got out before the engine stopped. He wore clean boots, a lodge-branded fleece, and the irritated face of someone who had expected the place to stay empty long enough for his plan to become easier. "Nora," he called from the open yard, "you don't need to bring county people into this." Iris looked through the cracked office window. "I'm not county people. I'm fisheries people. We're worse." Nora almost smiled. Grant stepped into the hatchery and stopped at the egg trough room doorway, taking in the flagged bridge, Iris's field case, and the open notebook on the trough. "You shouldn't be poking around in here. It's unsafe." "Then you shouldn't have asked me to sign off without seeing it," Nora said. "I asked you to be practical. Practical for the lodge owner." His jaw tightened. "The spring intake is the only thing here with value." Iris turned slowly toward him. "That's not the kind of sentence you say out loud in a room with water records." Grant looked at her as if she had inconvenienced him by existing. Nora stepped between them, not because Iris needed protecting, but because this was her inheritance and her refusal had to sound like hers. "I'm not signing intake access today." "Then when?" "When I understand what Simon left." Grant stared at her. "Simon left junk." The egg trough behind him gave a faint tremor. Everyone heard it. Pine pollen shivered along the line Nora had marked earlier, lifting in a soft traveling pulse from north to south. It crossed the trough in one thin wave and settled again. Grant turned toward it, the color slipping slightly from his face before he recovered. Iris moved first. She crouched at the pipe chase and pressed two fingers to the wood rail. "There it is." Nora stood still, watching the trough, as if looking away might make it stop being true. Grant cleared his throat. "Old pipes, that's all." "Probably," Iris said, "but old pipes are allowed to have records." The room held that sentence. Grant left 5 minutes later, saying he would talk to May, which sounded less like a threat than he wanted it to. Nora watched him drive up the lodge road until the trees swallowed the truck. Iris returned to the office and pointed to the wall in a sequence. "Access first, roof next, intake clearing only after the bridge is safe. Then raceway inspection. Then whatever Simon hid in plain sight." He hid something careful would stop before tearing it loose. Nora found a piece of dry chalk in the desk drawer. On the damp office board beside the window she wrote 4 words in a crooked line. Access, roof, intake, Trough. Then she stood back and looked at them until they felt less like problems and more like order. Nora came back 2 days later with a paper cup full of pine pollen, 3 strips of blue painter's tape, and the kind of sleep that leaves a person more careful than rested. She had spent the night in the pickup behind the closed ranger station, listening to rain tick on the cab roof and replaying the ripple in the trough until it seemed less like memory than a question she had been assigned. At dawn, she gathered the pollen from the low branches behind the turnout, tapping each cone over the cup as gently as if she were collecting evidence from a witness. Iris was already at the hatchery when Nora arrived. The fisheries truck sat beyond the rusted gate, and Iris was crouched near the spring intake with her sleeves rolled over rubber gloves. Beside her were a field notebook, a coil of flagging tape, and a small aluminum level. She did not look up until Nora stopped at the edge of the moss-choked grate. "You brought pollen," Iris said. "May said to write things down. You said old systems like proof." "Good. Today we let the trough tell us where the pulse starts." They crossed the footbridge together, stepping around the flagged plank and the leaning rail. The creek below ran colder and higher than before, swollen by the last rain. Nora felt the bridge dip under her weight and made herself slow down. Access first, roof next, intake, trough. The words on the office board had stayed with her not because they solved anything, but because they kept panic from choosing the order. Inside the hatchery was still. The egg trough room held its pale wooden trays in the gray light. The first trough, the one that had rippled twice, still carried the thin pollen line from Nora's first visit. It had shifted toward the drain slot overnight not far, but enough to show that the wood had moved or air had passed under it. Iris set a flashlight on the pipe chase and handed Nora a clean brush. "Dust the surface. Thin layer, no piles." Nora dipped the brush into the cup and spread pollen across the dry trough bottom. The yellow dust settled softly over the cedar, catching in the grain and along old nail lines. Iris marked the north end with tape, then the center, then the lower drain slot. "No valve movement yet," Iris said. Nora wrote it down. They waited. Nothing happened for almost 4 minutes. Then the pollen divided. A narrow line opened down the center of the trough, as if an invisible finger had drawn through it from below. The dust lifted not into the air, but into a soft, trembling seam. The movement began at the north end under the pipe chase and traveled south in a slow pulse that made the trough look briefly alive. Nora heard her own breath catch. Iris leaned closer, eyes fixed on the tape marks. "That's pressure transfer, not surface water. The support rail is vibrating under the trough. From the closed intake. From water behind the closed intake." Iris stood. "The valve stops flow into the trough. It doesn't stop pressure in the old pipe if the spring box is still loaded." They went to the north passage where the air smelled of cedar moss and cold stone. The passage narrowed behind the egg trough room and ended at a service panel beside the spring intake line. The pipe was galvanized, dulled with age, and banded by 3 rusted brackets. One bracket had worked loose from the wall. Another still held so tightly that the pipe seemed to vanish into it. Iris pressed her ear near the pipe without touching it. Nora waited. "There," Iris said. "You hear that?" At first, Nora heard only creak noise and her own jacket sleeve brushing the wall. Then she caught it, a faint, dull pulse spaced unevenly, more felt than heard, like water pushing against a closed door and withdrawing. Iris pointed to an old counterweight lever mounted on the wall behind a cobwebbed guard. "That shouldn't still be connected." "To what?" "The intake gate, or something that used to help balance it." Iris photographed the lever before reaching near it. "We don't force it. We test travel." The lever moved less than an inch before rust stopped it. Iris marked the position, applied a small amount of oil to the pivot, and waited. When she tried again, it dropped slowly to a halfway point and caught there with a low click from the office wall. Both women turned. The sound had not come from the pipe. They crossed back into the office. The old temperature chart beneath Simon's initials sat in its cloudy frame, still crooked from years of damp. Nora had not touched it since the first inspection. Now the left edge of the frame stood out from the wall by the width of a thumbnail. Iris took one look at it and said, "That's not a chart, that's a door pretending to be a chart." Nora's pulse moved into her hands. She photographed the frame before touching it. Iris photographed her photographing it, which would have annoyed Nora in another life. Here it felt proper. Nothing pulled from a hidden place should have to survive on memory alone. The chart frame did not lift, it slid. Nora pressed the lower edge and moved it left along a shallow groove. The glass rasped against dust. Behind it, a cedar panel released with a soft, wooden sigh. The smell that came out was dry, unlike the rest of the office cedar paper, and the faint mineral scent of old creek water sealed away from weather. The compartment was narrow and deliberate, built between 2 studs behind the chart case. Inside lay a brass fish tag no bigger than a quarter, a roll of water temperature charts tied with cotton string, a folded map, a thick ledger in oilcloth, and one envelope marked in Simon Vale's hand. For Nora. She did not reach for the envelope first. The brass tag sat on top of the oilcloth stamped SV on one side and Alder Run number 4 on the other. Its edges had gone dark with age, but the letters were clean. Nora lifted it with 2 fingers and felt the small weight of it settle in her palm. Her uncle had held this. Maybe many times. Maybe while standing exactly where she stood now, listening to water move through a system other people would later call dead. Iris stepped back, giving her room. "We need sleeves." "I don't have any." A voice from the doorway answered, "I do." Eli Mercer stood in the office entrance with a cardboard document box against one hip. He was 24, rain-haired and lanky, wearing a school outdoor program jacket and boots too clean for the hatchery yard. Nora knew him by sight from the county education office, where he helped run trail days for students who thought mud was funny until it entered their socks. "May sent me," he said. "She said if Simon's school papers were here, somebody should bring sleeves before somebody with wet hands got sentimental." Iris looked at Nora. "May has reach." "She has files," Eli said. "That's worse." The joke eased the room by one careful notch. They cleared the office desk with a shop towel and laid the items out in order. Brass tag, temperature charts, map, oilcloth ledger, envelope. Eli produced clean sleeves, index cards, and a pencil. Iris kept photographing the sequence, including the counterweight lever, the chart frame groove, the panel, and the compartment itself. Nora opened the first rolled chart only enough to see the heading: Alder Run Hatchery Spring Temperature and Stocking Notes. Below the title were dates, water readings, release counts, and notes about school visits. Some entries were purely technical. Others carried small human details: 3rd grade group delayed by washed bridge. Eli's class saw first fry release. Do not stock below lodge diversion after sediment event. Call May before signing access revision. Nora looked up. "This mentions you." Eli's face changed. "Me." She turned the chart so he could read the margin without touching it. He leaned over the desk. "My class came here when I was 8. I remember the troughs." He smiled once, barely. "Simon let us put thermometers in the water and made us wait 3 minutes before reading them. Said rushing a number was the same as lying." Nora looked at the envelope with her name on it. She wanted to open it. She wanted to leave it sealed. Both once arrived with the same force. Instead, she unfolded the map. It showed Alder Run from the spring box to the lower creek bend, the hatchery, raceways, the footbridge, the old school trail, and the lodge road south of the intake. A blue pencil line marked the spring rights corridor. Near the intake, Simon had written "Access protects measurement. Measurement protects water." Iris went still when she read it. "That's why the lodge wants it," she said. "If they control the intake access, they control who measures the spring." Nora set the map down very carefully. The egg trough room beyond the office gave a faint tremor. No one moved for a second. Then the trough pulsed again, and pine pollen shifted in its yellow line, answering the old pipe from the other side of the wall. The ripple was not the secret. It was the signal that the system still had pressure, still had memory, still had a path from water to record if someone cared enough to follow it. She looked at Iris, then Eli, then the hidden cedar panel behind Simon's temperature chart. "Photograph everything," she said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Nora read Simon's first temperature chart under May Rowan's records room lamp, because May refused to let damp paper tell its story in a damp building. The county records room occupied the back half of a low brick office beside the courthouse with one narrow window, 2 humming file cabinets, and a table broad enough for survey maps. May had cleared that table by the time Nora arrived. Iris set the wrapped ledger down first. Eli placed the document sleeves beside it. Nora carried the brass fish tag in a paper envelope and kept Simon's letter in her coat pocket until May held out one hand. "Everything on the table," May said. Nora looked at her. May did not soften. "You can keep grief private later. Right now, we preserve the source." So Nora put the envelope on the table. The temperature charts came first. There were 11 of them rolled in sets and tied with cotton string. Iris handled them like field records, which helped. She read headings, dates, water temperatures, hatch notes, release counts, and the remarks Simon had written in the margins. Some entries were ordinary enough to settle the room ice at intake. Check screen after storm. Fry release delayed 2 days. 3rd grade visit moved to Friday. Others changed the air. Below, lodge diversion sediment plume after grading. Do not sign access revision until school route and springbox agreement are copied. Temperature stable only when North Spring Gate remains unaltered. May has filing number. May's finger stopped on that last line. I do, she said. She went to a metal cabinet and returned with a folder labeled Alder Run Springbox Agreement 1984. The folder held a survey copy, 3 water use notices, and a typed agreement stating that access to the spring intake must remain available for hatchery maintenance, watershed monitoring, and educational use tied to the old school trail. The lodge road could cross near the lower boundary, but could not control the springbox or restrict measurement access without the hatchery owner's consent. Nora read the clause twice. Grant's voice came back to her with sudden clarity. The spring intake is the only thing here with value. May looked at her over the top of her glasses. Now you know why. The ledger came next. It was not about money in the way Grant would understand. It was a watershed ledger, half technical, half civic record. Simon had logged temperatures, turbidity, spring flow, changes, student visits, volunteer stocking days, maintenance hours, and notes from downstream families who depended on the creek remaining clear enough for irrigation screens, wells, and school science trips. There were hatchery route maps folded between pages, each marked with release points, trail access, and sections of creek Simon had monitored after storms. Eli leaned over one page and went still. "That's my school group," he said. Nora turned the ledger enough for him to read without touching. In the margin, Simon had written Mercer Group, waited full 3 minutes before reading thermometers. Good lesson. No rushing water, no rushing numbers. Eli laughed once under his breath. It had no humor in it. Only recognition. "He said that to us," Eli said. "I thought I remembered it wrong." Iris was looking at the spring rights map. "This is better than a memory. If the county accepts the education use clause, the lodge can't separate the intake access from the hatchery without a review." May nodded. "Not cleanly. Not cleanly is enough," Nora said. She heard herself say it, and felt the sentence settle into a shape that could hold. Then May opened Simon's letter. She did not read it aloud. She turned it toward Nora first. "Nora, if you found this behind the chart, then the trough still listens to the spring. That means the system was never dead, only closed." Nora pressed her thumb against the table edge. Simon wrote that he had kept the hatchery records because the creek had a way of being claimed by whoever could afford the better lawyer. The lodge wanted the spring because spring water made clean brochures, quiet cabins, and expensive promises. The school wanted the spring because children needed a place to put their hands in cold water and learn that measurements belong to everyone. Downstream families needed it because clean flow was not an idea to them. It was screens, gardens, wells, and late summer shade. He wrote about Nora, too, but not kindly in the easy way. You leave things half-finished when shame tells you finishing will prove you cared. That is a habit, not a sentence. The hatchery does not need you to be certain. It needs you to measure repair and refuse to sell the hand that opens the water. She had to stop reading there. The room did not move. Iris looked down at the map. Eli straightened the sleeve packet by 1 inch, which gave Nora the mercy of silence. Nora read the rest privately. Simon had left instructions: preserve the charts, copy the school notes, file the spring agreement, repair access before entering the intake passage. Keep the deepest family pages sealed unless Nora chose otherwise. At the bottom, in a steadier hand than the opening lines, he had written the sentence that explained the whole hidden compartment. Water remembers the hand that measured it. Nora folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the brass fish tag. Grant arrived 15 minutes later. He came in without knocking, which told Nora that someone at the clerk's counter had mentioned the folder and he had decided speed mattered more than courtesy. He stopped when he saw the table charts, ledger map, spring agreement letter, brass tag, and May Rowan standing at the far end like a locked door with a county seal. "What is this?" Grant asked. "Records," May said. He looked at Nora. "You brought private estate papers to the county." Nora kept her hand on the edge of the table. "Simon filed the spring agreement years ago." Grant's face changed not enough for anyone else to call it fear, but enough for Nora to see the plan in him adjusting. "The lodge offer still stands," he said. "I'm not signing intake access. You can't afford that place. I know. It's unsafe. I know that too." His frustration sharpened. Then what exactly are you doing? I'm finding out what it was for before I let someone else call it useless. Grant had no answer that did not make him sound like the man Simon had anticipated. May slid the spring rights agreement into a clear sleeve and set the brass fish tag on top of the folded map so it would not curl. The little tag caught the lamplight SV dark against old brass. Outside the records room window, rain began to tap the sill. Inside, the map stayed flat. Nora and Iris braced the creek footbridge before they touched anything that looked more interesting. The bridge had become the first test of whether Nora could repair a place in the order it needed instead of the order her fear preferred. She wanted to go straight to the intake passage, to the pipe chase, to the hidden chart frame, and everything Simon had left behind it. Iris handed her a cedar post, a box of structural screws, and a strip of orange tape. "Access first," Iris said. Nora repeated the words without arguing. The creek ran fast below the planks, cold and white at the rocks. Iris marked the unsafe boards with chalk, then used a pry bar to lift the split plank near the center. Nora held the replacement board, while Eli, who had arrived with coffee and 2 pairs of dry gloves, steadied the rail. May stood back on the bank with the county folder in one hand and watched the work like it mattered because it did. The first screw went in crooked. Nora backed it out and tried again. Her hands were cold enough to ache, but the board drew down tight the second time. Iris packed a cedar shim under the sagging west join, then made Nora step on the repaired section before anyone else. The bridge held. Not perfectly. It still moved with the creek air and old timber flex, but it no longer dropped under her boot the way it had on the first day. Nora stood on the center plank and felt the difference between danger hidden and danger marked braced and respected. Eli looked over the rail at the water. "The school trail used to cross here," according to Simon, Nora said. "Then we'll need a handrail kids can trust." Iris glanced at him. "We need one adults can trust first." Nora looked toward this Hatchery building. Its windows were still cracked. Its raceways still held silt. Its feed room roof still sagged at one corner. But the way in had become honest. That was not a small beginning. The roof over the feed room had failed, where snow had sat too long against the seam. Iris would not let Nora climb until Ben Talbot from the road crew loaned them a ladder standoff and checked the ground for sink. The hatchery roof was low, but low roofs still hurt people when they gave way. Nora climbed only to the point Iris approved and worked from the ladder, while Eli passed up a tarp edge and May documented the damage below. Water had been falling through the feed room corner, then running under the interior wall toward the office. That explained the damp smell near Simon's chart frame and the swelling at the base of the file cabinet. Nora hated the leak more once she understood its path. It had not been random. It had been patient. They laid flashing under the lifted metal edge, fastened the tarp along the ridge, and weighted the lower fold so rain would shed toward the overflow ditch instead of the office wall. The patch was temporary, blue and ugly, and necessary. When the next cloud passed and a thin rain began, the water ran down the outside where Iris wanted it. May watched the line of runoff and nodded. "Good. Now the records won't keep paying for the roof." Inside, Nora moved the chart sleeves to the dry side of the office and propped the file cabinet on 2 blocks. Eli labeled the temporary shelf. Iris checked the wall with a moisture meter and marked the worst spots with pencil. Nothing became beautiful, but the building stopped losing itself through one open wound. Nora wrote on the office board below her first list, "Roof sheds away from office." The words felt plain enough to be trusted. May refused to let the records return to the hatchery until they had been copied, sleeved, and separated by use. The charts went into one group: temperature records, release dates, spring measurements. The maps went into another: spring intake, raceways, school trail, Lower Creek Bend. The school notes went into a third because Eli said children's names should not become public just because a county board needed proof. Simon's letter stayed in a private sleeve Nora marked "family only." The spring rights agreement got a clear folder with May's filing number written at the top in dark pencil. Eli handled the school visit notes with visible care. He found his class listed twice, once for the thermometer lesson and once for a fry release delayed by high water. The second note included the name of his old teacher who had died the previous winter. He looked at the line for a long time. I didn't know we were part of a record. Most people don't, May said, until they need one. Iris brought in photographs from the bridge repair roof patch and intake condition. May arranged those behind the maps. Nora filled out the inventory card because May said ownership was not just holding a key, it was being willing to attach your name to evidence. The brass fish tag went into a small envelope and then into the same box as the chart copies. Nora wrote SV on the label and paused. Not Uncle Simon, not yet. Just SV exactly as he had stamped it because records should begin with what can be proven. Grant came back with the lodge owner this time. The man's name was Hollis Crane, and he had the quiet polish of someone who knew how to make taking sound like maintenance. He stood beside the rusted gate with a folded agreement and looked over the hatchery without stepping in mud any farther than necessary. Grant stood just behind him, too relieved to be following someone else's lead. "We're not here to interfere," Hollis said. Iris made a small sound that could have been a cough. Hollis continued anyway. "The lodge is prepared to assume responsibility for spring intake clearance. That relieves Nora of liability and protects the creek." May opened the county folder before Nora could answer. "The 1984 Spring Box Agreement already protects monitoring access." Hollis smiled politely. "Agreements can be updated." "Not without the hatchery owner's consent," May said. All eyes moved to Nora. She felt the old pull, then the desire to be done to let someone else carry the paperwork, the water, the bridge, the county. One signature would make the problem quieter. It would also make Simon's charts harder to reach Eli's school route, easier to erase, and the spring measurable only by the people who wanted it private. "No," Nora said. Grant's face tightened. "You don't have the money to keep this place." "I know. You don't have the permits." "Not yet." Hollis folded the agreement with care. "You understand the county may still order a cleanup," May answered before Nora had to. "Then the county will read the monitoring record first." Iris stood by the footbridge, one hand on the repaired rail. Eli waited in the office doorway with the boxed copies behind him. Nora looked at all of them, then at the hatchery, then at the spring intake beyond the north wall. The words were Simon's and hers at once. Grant looked away first. Hollis left the agreement on the hood of his clean truck as if Nora might pick it up after everyone stopped watching. She did not. When they drove off, the paper lifted once in the wind and settled under the wiper blade. Nora turned back toward the hatchery. The bridge held under her first step. The intake did not open like a door. It opened like an argument that had been waiting years for someone patient enough to lose. Iris made Nora clean the moss from the grate first with a hand rake and a soft brush, not because the moss caused the pulse, but because hidden water systems deserved clear sight lines before anyone blamed them. The spring box sat north of the hatchery in a cedar shed no larger than a pantry, its roof green with needles and its stone base still tight under the mud. Water pressed behind the old screen with a constant sound, low and contained. "Don't force the gate," Iris said. "I heard you the first 3 times. You were holding a wrench during 2 of them." Nora set the wrench down. They worked the counterweight lever in quarter-inch moves. Iris marked each point. Nora watched the pipe chase through the open passage, listening for the dull pulse that had traveled under the egg trough. When the lever reached the halfway mark, Simon had scratched into the wall. The pulse shifted. Not louder, cleaner. Iris smiled without looking up. There. What changed? The system stopped fighting itself. She explained it by drawing with a pencil on the back of a chart sleeve. Spring pressure behind the closed gate, old air, trapped in the line vibration passing through the support rail under the dry trough. The ripple had never been a miracle or a warning in the theatrical sense. It was pressure seeking the route it had been built to use. Nora looked at the drawing, then at the spring box. So the trough was listening. "In mechanical terms," Iris said. Nora folded the drawing and slipped it into her notebook. She liked the mechanical terms. They did not make the moment smaller. They made it something she could repair. The raceways took 2 full days to clear. Cedar needles came first, then silt, then 2 broken egg trays that had wedged themselves near the lower drain slot. Eli helped carry debris out in feed buckets while May logged the work for the county file. Nora scraped each trough and raceway by hand, careful not to gouge the concrete or tear loose the old cedar stands. Iris checked cracks with dye, measured the worst separation, and marked sections that could be used only for demonstration, not livestock. That distinction mattered. Nora had been tempted to talk about reopening the hatchery as if desire could become permission. Iris corrected that before it took root. Seasonal classroom and monitoring station first, she said. No fish until water quality permits and the structure all agree. Nora nodded, embarrassed by how much she had wanted a larger answer. The egg trough cleaned more easily than the raceways. Beneath the pollen dust and old feed grit, the cedar still held a pale grain. Nora lifted each broken screen, rinsed it, and set aside what could be repaired. When she cleared the drain slot at the lower end, a thread of old brown water slipped out and vanished into the channel below. The trough looked empty again. This time, empty did not feel abandoned. It felt ready. On the office board below, access roof intake trough, Nora wrote, "Demo only. Measure first." Eli read it and nodded. Simon would have liked that. Nora ran a damp cloth along the trough edge. He would have corrected my handwriting. The first clean water test happened on a morning cold enough to make breath visible. May brought the county observation form. Eli brought 3 blank watershed notebooks from the school supply closet. Iris brought a thermometer, a flow cup, dye tablets, and the calm severity of someone who would stop the test if the water lied. Nora brought Simon's brass tag in her jacket pocket, not for luck, but because the day belonged partly to him. They stood in the egg trough room while Iris checked the intake one last time. "Gate opening 1 inch, she said. Nora wrote it down. Iris nodded. Nora turned the counterweight lever to the mark Simon had carved. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the pipe gave a low knock, water entered the trough through the restored line, and a clear ripple traveled from north to south. Not under dry wood now. Through water. Honest, visible, measurable water. Pine pollen from an open window touched the surface and spread into a thin yellow veil, then parted as the flow settled. Iris placed the thermometer in the trough and waited a full 3 minutes before reading it. 46 degrees, she said. Eli smiled. No rushing water, no rushing numbers. Nora wrote the temperature on the new chart. Her hand did not shake. The flow held. The drain carried. No wall bulged. No trough seam leaked. It was not a full hatchery return, and nobody pretended otherwise. But clean spring water moved where it was supposed to move, under measurement, under witness, with the records open on the office table. May signed the observation line. Nora stood beside the trough and watched the water ripple steadily. Proof did not feel like triumph. It felt quieter than that. It felt like being trusted with a task and not leaving before the reading was taken. The stewardship plan fit on 3 pages because May refused to let hope become decorative. Page 1 named the property Alder Run Hatchery. Page 2 named the limits: seasonal access, no unsupervised public entry, demonstration trough, only raceways monitored but not stocked, spring box measured, monthly school visits by appointment, private family letter sealed. Page 3 named the people: Nora as owner and site steward, Iris as fisheries advisor, Eli as school program contact, May as county record custodian. Grant's name did not appear. Neither did Hollis Crane's. At the county review, Hollis spoke once about liability and once about efficient water use. Iris answered the water question. May answered the agreement question. Eli answered the education question. Nora answered the ownership question. "I'm not opening a fish farm," she said. "I'm keeping a measuring place alive." That was the sentence the board wrote down. The cleanup notice was not erased. It was converted into a conditional stewardship order, which sounded less beautiful than it felt. The hatchery would stay under inspection. The footbridge would need a full rail. The roof patch would need permanent repair before winter. The raceways could not hold livestock. All of that was true. Still, the county stopped calling it abandoned. After the meeting, Grant waited by the courthouse steps. He looked tired, not defeated. That made it easier to speak to him like a cousin instead of a threat. "You could have told me Simon filed the agreement," Nora said. "I didn't know the whole thing. You knew enough to make the offer sound clean." He looked down the street. Hollis made it sound clean to me, too. She believed him only halfway. Halfway was enough for the moment. "If you want to help," she said, "the footbridge needs a rail." Grant looked at her, startled by the practical shape of the sentence. Then he nodded once. "Saturday," he said. By early June, the hatchery no longer looked deserted from the road. It did not look restored either. The difference mattered to Nora. The roof still carried its blue tarp on one corner. The raceways still held warning flags where the cracks needed proper repair. The office window still wore a temporary pane. But the footbridge had a real rail. Now the overflow ditch ran clear, the spring intake grate had been cleaned, and the egg trough room smelled of cedar cold water and open air instead of old feed dust. The first classroom day came with 12 students, 3 adults, and a weather forecast May had checked twice. Eli arrived early, with blank watershed notebooks and pencils tied in bundles with twine. Iris set the thermometer cups on the counter. May placed the public record copies on the office shelf and kept Simon's private letter sealed in a flat box where Nora could reach it and no one else needed to. Grant came with 2 extra cedar boards and left them by the bridge without asking where to stand. Nora opened the intake gate under Iris's supervision. Water entered the egg trough cleanly, a slow clear line first, then a steady ripple. The students leaned forward but did not touch until Eli gave permission. One girl counted 3 minutes aloud while the thermometer settled. Another drew the raceway layout in her notebook, making the cracked concrete look almost graceful. A boy near the end of the line asked why the hatchery had closed if the water still worked. Nora looked at the trough at the charts at the creek beyond the office window. Because useful places still need people to keep measuring, she said. That answer satisfied him more than a bigger one would have. At noon, after the students left and the notebooks were stacked to dry, Nora opened a fresh temperature chart and wrote the date. She added the flow mark, the weather, the class visit, and one note in the remarks column. Then she hung the chart beside Simon's older ones. The brass fish tag stayed in its envelope on the archive shelf. The spring rights agreement stayed filed. The lodge kept its road and lost the spring. The hatchery kept its water and gained a future small enough to be believable. Nora stood in the egg trough room after everyone had gone and listened. The water moved steadily now, no longer a hidden pulse under dry wood, but a clear ripple through the restored trough. Nora touched the edge of the map to keep it from curling. Inside, clean spring water rippled through the trough, and for once the work in front of her did not feel unfinished.